Thank you. Thanks, Tim. It's a total honor to be up here. I feel like I should have some Shakespeare ready for you here. But right. But I don't. I'm a huge fan of NK Architect's work and the leadership that they play in the high-performance building world and the high-performance design world, and this effort to promulgate Passive House in the industry. So it's really a pleasure to be part of this series that you've put together. So thank you.
You're here.
Yeah, good work. So I'm going to say just a couple words about Hammer in Hand so you have a little bit of context about where I come from. So Hammer in Hand is a construction company. We don't do any design in-house. So we partner with architects on every project we do. And as a company of carpenters, our entree to the world of sustainability comes through this notion that the most fundamental form of sustainability is to build to last. And that's why Passive House has been a really natural fit for us, because Passive House is built on these underpinnings of building science and this understanding of the way that heat, air, and moisture interact with building assemblies and with buildings as a whole. So through Passive House, you have something that combines a sustainable construction approach that combines super energy efficiency, but also delivers durability. So for us, that just really makes a lot of sense to us. So we build projects. We build both Passive House and non-Passive House. We do residential and commercial work. And I'm going to just show you a few of the examples from our Passive House portfolio before diving in. So one is the Karuna House, designed by Holst Architecture. It's won a bunch of awards and earned a whole laundry list of certifications. A really fun project for us to work on. The Pumpkin Ridge Passive House, designed by Scott Edwards Architecture, and it won the 2015 Department of Energy Housing Innovation Award. The Glasswood project is the first commercial Passive House retrofit in North America. So some interesting challenges there. And then closer to home from our work in Seattle is the Madrona Passive House, which is also registered with the Living Future Institute as a net zero energy building. So in a few months, we hope that we need a year's worth of numbers to show that we've actually hit the mark, and it's looking good. So hopefully that means that we'll have a net zero energy building certified by Living Future Institute. The Living Future Institute they're friends, they're neighbors. Our Seattle so we have offices in Portland and Seattle, and our Seattle office is at the Bullitt Center. So I get a direct experience in the benefits of a living building, because I get to work in one every day, and it's a fantastic place. So in addition to the construction work we do consulting on high-performance building, and Dan Whitmore is our in-house consultant. Dan, where are you? Can you wave? Oh, there you are. He's waving really small. So he certifies projects around North America, so we get to be involved in the North American movement in that way, and also through our Passive House stores that we build in our shop in Portland. All right, so to dive in. So my talk is going to be about hope and climate action. But before I think we can engage with those topics, we need to ground ourselves in the severity of the climate crisis. And this photo is a good place to start. So this shows the sunrise from the International Space Station. And that thin blue line is our atmosphere. And I think that, when we look up at the sky, it looks big. So we assume that the atmosphere is vast. But it's actually quite small and quite thin. And if you think in planetary terms, so if the Earth were an apple, the atmosphere would be thinner than the skin on that apple. Yet we're pumping over 100 million tons of carbon pollution into it every day. So we're really threatening this delicate balance that's been set up and the atmosphere that supports life as we know it. And that's changing, of course, the composition of the atmosphere. So I think most of us have seen this graph. It shows the last 400,000 years. And CO2 levels have never been higher than 300 parts per million, except for in about 1960, when we blew past 300 parts per million. Now we've blown past 350 parts per million, which was the line of safety that James Hansen, then of NASA, outlined for us. And we're in uncharted territories. We're now at 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, to give you an idea of the impact that has on warming, the greenhouse gases that we've added to the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, the warming impact of those greenhouse gases is equivalent to the heat energy released by the detonation of 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs every day. It sounds crazy, but look it up. It's true. And that, of course, is having major impacts on the global temperature rise, right? This just came out a couple weeks ago from Ed Hawkins, and it's an animation of what's happening with temperature. And what I'd like you to do is check out the pace of change that we're seeing. So it started in 1850. There's a long period of stasis, and then things start cooking. And then in our lifetimes, this is what we see. It's pretty dramatic, right? So that's March of 2016. We're nearly at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming in March of 2016. Part of the reason that looks so crazy at the outside there is that we had an El Nino year, so that makes the warming worse. But most of the reason that we're seeing this happen, of course, is the greenhouse gas concentrations in our atmosphere. And that's having all sorts of impacts. And I know you guys all read the headlines, so I'm not going to spend a bunch of time talking about it. I'm going to spend very little time talking about it. But we're talking about ocean acidification, warming of oceans, coral bleaching, the whole litany of sea level rise and droughts and all sorts of scary stuff. So I'm not going to talk about the details of that at all. But I do want to just note that one of the reasons that this is scary is that we're talking about nonlinear change here and the potential for exponential change. And that is fueled by vicious cycles, so positive feedback loops that have a really negative outcome. And the first one that I learned about when I was learning about climate science in college was that of the albedo effect. And the albedo effect is basically how reflective the Earth is. And so the more ice is on the Earth, the higher the albedo effect, and therefore the more of the sun's energy reflects off the Earth as light instead of being absorbed by the Earth as heat energy. And with warming, of course, ice melts, and that means that there's less reflectivity, less albedo effect, and therefore more of the solar energy is absorbed as heat, which can increase warming, which increases melting, which means more energy is absorbed as heat, and that can start taking off. I'm just going to do 3 of these. These are scary. I promise we'll get into some more hopeful stuff in a little while. But this is what we're up against, right? So the permafrost methane, the methane that's trapped in our permafrost currently, if all of that was released, we would be in big, big trouble. Because methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, and there's a lot of methane in the permafrost right now. So as the Earth warms, some of that permafrost melts, some of the methane is released into the atmosphere, which means more warming, which means more melting, and that can start taking off. So one new vicious cycle that just got identified by James Hansen, who I mentioned earlier with the 350 parts per million, he's no longer at NASA. But he and 18 other climate scientists from around the world released a study, and I imagine many of you heard about it, that describes a new vicious cycle. And there are all sorts of potential vicious cycles in climate change. I'm just doing 3. And that is that when ice melt water pools at the poles, that accelerates the disintegration of ice sheets. It sets up a process that accelerates the disintegration of ice sheets, which means more ice melts, which means more ice melt water pools at the poles, and that starts taking off. And that's why that group of scientists is predicting multi-meter sea level rise in our lifetimes, certainly by 2100, if we don't curb emissions in a really aggressive way. Oh my God, yeah. You gotta start with some reality, and then we'll move into this. So obviously we need to turn this around, right? My God, we need to turn this around. And when you look at the potential solutions, they actually sort out into some fairly simple categories. So one is that we need to conserve energy and use it more efficiently. So passive house is a great example. 2, we need to transition from fossil fuels to clean energy. So when we put solar panels on our roofs, we're part of that category. We need to be better about the way we use land. We use land, the forests. We need to reforest, and also be good about the way we are stewards of our forests, because they contain a lot of carbon and they're a great carbon sink. Similarly with soils, healthy soils have tons of carbon in them, right? And they can be a great way to sequester carbon. So those are both good ways. And there's this other category that comes up that needs to be looked at, I think, with some serious caution because of the risk of unintended consequences. So we're currently at 48 gigatons of CO2 equivalent of emissions right now. We know that there's going to be population increase, and we know that there is going to be, we hope anyway, that there will be billions of people rising out of poverty, that we'll see economic development. So if we continue business as usual with population increase and economic development going on, we're headed toward crazy territory up there, 92 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emitted by 2050. Paris was a major step forward. It gets us basically flat, that's the gray line, and gives us a mechanism to ratchet it down. So that's really good news, but we have a long ways to go. What we need to target is 2, ideally 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, which means a 73% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2050 in the face of population increase and economic development. So all of us in this room know that buildings are part of the problem. We've all heard the Architecture 2030 stat that nearly half of our buildings, or nearly half of our CO2 in the US comes from our buildings, and most of that is coming from operations. So we say, great, we know that buildings are part of the problem. That means that buildings can be part of the solution, right? And we have passive house, which is a fantastic way to get there. It's this knowable, predictable, field-tested means to slash heating energy by as much as 90% and overall energy use by as much as 60 or 70%. So we can pat ourselves on the back and say, if we're doing passive house, we're part of the solution. This is awesome. But wait. So this guy is William S. Jevons, and he was a Scottish economist in the 1800s. And he is quoting here from his book, The Coal Question, that he wrote in 1865, and he says, "It is a confusion of ideas to suppose that the economical use of fuel is equivalent to diminished consumption." In other words, we are confused if we think energy efficiency reduces consumption. In fact, the very contrary is the truth. And he goes on to say that energy efficiency causes more energy consumption, not less. And the reason, he says, is that when you make something more energy efficient, we just end up using it more. And so you have a backfire effect, basically, where you just use it more and you end up consuming more energy. So I want to spend a few minutes and allow you guys to talk about this a little bit amongst yourselves. And I have a couple questions that I hope that you'll discuss. So one is this true? I mean, can you think of examples in your life where energy efficiency drives more consumption? And if it is true, what does that mean for passive building and uber-efficient buildings? And finally, who stands to gain from promoting this idea? So I'm going to set you guys loose for a few minutes, and then I'll come and wave my arms around and dive in deeper. Thanks. All right, ladies and gentlemen. So, is the Jevons Paradox true? To a point, that's good, that's good. All right, I'm going to dive in a little bit more to the Jevons Paradox. And so Jevons based the paradox, or the ideas that became known as the paradox, on his observations of the James Watt steam engine in the early days of the Industrial Revolution. And the James Watt steam engine was this amazing technological breakthrough. It was incredibly energy efficient, way more energy efficient than its predecessor. So it could do a whole bunch more work using a lot less coal. And the folks at the time were excited about that because they were concerned about dwindling coal supply. And so they had this new machine that promised to do all the work that the economy needed to have done and could extend that coal supply for decades longer. But what ended up happening is, in short order, the consumption of coal increased by an order of magnitude. And it increased by an order of magnitude because people started using this thing for everything, because it was so good at what it did. So people used it in textiles, in manufacturing, in transportation, you name it. The James Watt steam engine was there, and it became the poster child of the Industrial Revolution. It really drove the Industrial Revolution. And a couple things needed to be put in place to set up this very elastic demand curve in relation to energy. This is essentially the definition of the Jevons Paradox, the backfire, where efficiency becomes counterproductive to reducing consumption. So you see on the left we've got the cost of the energy input. That goes down by 75% thanks to the energy efficiency of this new machine. These are hypothetical numbers, but they illustrate the point. And lo and behold, though, the use of the machine goes up by 500%, more than offsetting the energy efficiency gains. So the two things that needed to be put into place, or were in place in order to set this up, was a system that was very sensitive to the price of energy, to the coal input. And if you think about a steam engine and its systems, the coal is a huge piece of that puzzle. There also had to be really lots of pent-up demand for cheap production. And there was lots of that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So those two things set this up. The thing is that for most things in our world, we instead see a very inelastic demand curve that is not all that sensitive to energy. And the reason for that is that energy is only one of many, many, many inputs. So to illustrate that, a Prius driver, the decision making that a Prius driver makes, a Prius is, yeah, I see, it's a good example, right? Nicely done. Nicely done. Well, it's Tadashi, so.
I drive a lot.
Yeah. Well, then you're going to undermine my example here, but that's okay. So a Prius is roughly twice as fuel efficient as the other cars on the road, but you don't see Prius drivers driving twice as much as the rest of us. It bears out, they drive the same as the rest of us. And the reason for that, of course, is that you are not making, as a Prius driver, you are making your decision to drive based on other things, not necessarily the price of gas. It might be a small part of it, but there are all sorts of other more important factors that go into that decision making. So if I own a Prius and I'm filling it up at the tank or at the pump, I am saving roughly half, or I'm saving a lot of money on gas compared to my contemporaries. And I might use a little bit of that to drive more, or maybe I'll use it to buy some like an iPad that took energy to produce and took energy to ship around and uses a tiny bit of energy to use. And so there is a rebound where efficiency isn't perfect at reducing consumption. But I also might use, if I'm feeling virtuous, I might use some of that money to switch from conventional produce to organic produce. Or if I'm really doing great, buy some solar panels and put them on my roof. Or better yet, do a deep energy retrofit of my house. So it really matters what you do with that money that you have saved from this energy efficiency. And the late Dr. Lee Shipper, who was at Stanford and also at Berkeley before then, puts it well. He says that the key to understanding Jevons is that the things where energy is a very high part of the cost are very few and far between in our economy. So we're talking about a few metals, a few chemicals, and air travel. And that's it. And so those are the things that are exposed to the possibility of a backfire like the Jevons Paradox. And otherwise, we're looking at much smaller rebound territory. So why am I talking about the Jevons Paradox? Why does it come up? And I think probably many of us have heard it come up. It was actually featured in a couple of keynotes at the Passive House Conference about 14 months ago. One of the answers is politics. Basically, that if you are anti-regulation and anti-energy efficiency measures, you love the story of Jevons Paradox. So like the opinion writers at Wall Street Journal, the libertarian think tank, the Cato Institute, and these guys, the Breakthrough Initiative, they're interesting. They've got some branding down. They call themselves an eco-modernist think tank. So you can wrap your mind around that. And so they say they're pro-climate, they're pro-gas and pro-nuke, they're anti most forms of renewable energy, they're anti-carbon tax, anti-regulation, and very pro-Jevons. And they're actually the ones that are behind promulgating this notion and really promoting this notion of the Jevons Paradox out in the world. And they're at eco-modernist think tank, so they get a lot of play. And this is where they write their stuff. And so the point I want to make is that when we're talking about the Jevons Paradox, there is a political axe grinding, I guarantee it. All right, so what is the story, though? What's the storytelling that goes around the Jevons Paradox? The favorite story is that of the double-wide fridge. Yeah. So, yeah. So the story goes like this. Back in the 40s, when refrigerators first came on the scene, they were very energy inefficient. But over time, they've become more and more efficient, partly because of energy efficiency mandates that have said to manufacturers, you got to do it. And so there's been technological innovation that has driven energy efficiency to really great levels. And so we now we have Energy Star fridges, these wonderful fridges, really energy efficient. Back in the 40s, fridges were also really small. And over time, they've gotten larger and larger and larger until here you go. Behold, the double-wide fridge in the American kitchen. Proof, the Jevons people say, that energy efficiency causes greater consumption, not less. In this case, the size is a proxy for consumption. So never mind that a totally plausible explanation for this is that we've become wealthier as Americans since the 1940s, and we have larger houses and we have larger kitchens that can fit these things, right? But what was that?
They have 12 kids.
Right, they have 12 kids, yeah, absolutely. So, but let's take a closer look at this notion that efficiency causes fridge size to increase, which is what the Jevons folks are talking about. First of all, correlation doesn't equal causation. So the age of Miss America correlates really well by murders by steam, hot vapors, and hot objects. And per capita consumption of chicken correlates really well with total US crude oil imports. And this one is alarming to me because I love cheese. The per capita cheese consumption correlates with the number of people who died becoming tangled in their bed sheets. That's some alarming stuff. And that is a lot of deaths from bed sheet entanglement. So we know, obviously, the correlation does not equal causation. But if it were true that energy efficiency drives increase in fridge size, then we should at least see those two variables track closely together, right? The graph of efficiency and fridge size should look like this. But this is what it actually looks like. So this comes from the physicist David Goldstein, who works with NRDC. He does a whole bunch of great writing. He shows up on Green Building Advisor from time to time. And he shared this in his arguments about Jevons Paradox. So I'm borrowing from his work here. And the red line shows fridge size, the volume of fridges over time. From 1947 to early 2000s, we see a really rapid increase in fridge size for the first few decades. And then it flattens out for a while, and then there's a little blip at the end. The blue line is the energy use of fridges, so kind of roughly an inverse relationship with energy efficiency. So the first few decades, we see really rapid increase in energy use along with the increase in fridge size, and then suddenly a precipitous decline. That's when the first energy efficiency standard got put into place, and manufacturers responded by making their refrigerators more efficient. And you see standard after standard driving energy efficiency to really great levels and driving energy use down along with it. Now, if Jevons were true with double-size or double-wide fridges, then the moment that the energy efficiency drives energy use down, we should see the red line spike up. But that's the moment that the red line flattens, and there's no evidence for the Jevons paradox here. So what we're finding is and what the economic literature shows is that rebounds are real, they're just not very big. So the Energy Journal did a survey of literature saying that there's a 10 to 30% rebound in residential and transportation sectors and a 0 to 20% rebound in the industrial sector, which means, of course, that energy efficiency is 70 to 100% effective. So it's not perfect, but it's damn good at what it does. And in our world of high-performance building and passive house, particularly with single-family projects, where there's a significant investment up front that needs to happen to bring the project to great levels of efficiency. That investment is offset by ongoing utility bill savings, but those are balanced out. So there's not a whole bunch of extra money to fritter away on burning energy. So my argument would be that in our world, this rebound effect is likely very small or non-existent. Okay, so that's all in the microeconomic scale. So we're looking at the scale of refrigerators and cars and houses. So the Jevons folks now have pivoted to the macroeconomic scale. So we're looking at the scale of entire economies now. And by its very nature, macroeconomics is murkier territory. It's tougher to prove and disprove stuff in this. And if you open a macroeconomic study up, you're going to see page upon page of stylized economic models that are full of embedded assumptions. That's just part of it. And data goes into this sausage maker full of this embedded assumptions and then comes out, right? And so it's politically fraught, and it's complicated, and it's tough to make causal claims. But here's the story that they say here. In 1650, we were lighting our houses and our buildings with terribly inefficient candles. Today, fast forward to 2016, and we have these wonderful, very, very efficient LED light bulbs. Likewise, back in 1650, we were heating our houses with really inefficient fireplaces. Now we have wonderful Energy Star furnaces and miraculous heat pump technology doing the same thing. And if you look at almost any technology, you're going to see some steady or sometimes very fast increases in energy efficiency. However, this is what's happened with US per capita energy use. Between 1650 and today, we see a 10 times increase. So the Jevons Paradox, people say, there you go. Efficiency causes more consumption, not less. Voila, the Jevons Paradox is there, QED. But again, I think that it's sort of a variation on Occam's razor, and that's that I think the burden of proof needs to be on a paradoxical argument when there is a totally plausible explanation for the same conditions. And in this case, the plausible explanation is twofold, and that's affluence and technology. We've become more affluent as a society during this time, and we have more money to spend on burning energy. And secondly, technology. We've come up with technologies that are really great at burning energy, like the internal combustion engine, which, by the way, correlates to when that really starts spiking. And it's not the energy efficiency of internal combustion engines that's the problem. It's that Ford figured out how to mass produce them and make them affordable to buy, right? So it's the technology itself, not its energy efficiency, that's the issue. And those two have come together to cause this issue. But we can do a quick test and compare two economies to one another. So we can compare the economy of California and then the economy of the rest of the United States, right? And California is a subset of the United States. That's kind of convenient. And we know that California has been ahead of the rest of us for decades on energy efficiency. So therefore, they must use more energy than the rest of us, right? So this is the cumulative effect of the efficiency standards that have been in place in California since 1975. So we see appliance standards, building standards, utility efficiency. Now, if Jevons were true at the macroeconomic scale, then we should expect to see the energy use of Californians spike as these come into play, because energy efficiency causes more consumption, not less. Instead, this is what we see. That black line shows where the efficiency standards are put into place. The orange line is showing California electricity use per capita. So when that line comes, when the efficiency gets put into place, we see per capita electricity use flatline, and for the rest of us, it just keeps on going up. I'm not claiming a causal relationship here for the California energy use. I am saying that there's no evidence for Jevons paradox here. So which brings me to this quote, which Amory Lovins shared as part of his description of Jevons. And that sometimes a concept is baffling, not because it is profound, but because it is wrong. And maybe Jevons just doesn't apply to our world today. But even if it does, even if it's hidden somewhere in the macroeconomic data, there's one simple cure for the Jevons paradox and all the other smaller rebound effects that we've been talking about. And it's fairly widely acknowledged as a great cure, and that's to put a price on carbon. And I know it's customary to say that's politically infeasible, and we look at Washington, D.C., and it certainly seems like that's not going to happen there. But as many of us know, there's one that will be on the ballot this fall. There's another one coming down the pike in Washington. British Columbia has a carbon tax. The World Bank is going around and advocating for meaningful carbon taxes around the world right now after Paris. So things are starting to shift, and these guys want a carbon tax. 6 oil majors in the months leading up to the Paris conference banded together and signed a letter together advocating for a meaningful carbon tax. Now, I'm not saying I necessarily trust these guys. And there are many theories about why they did this. The most skeptical is that it's just a PR ploy, and there won't be a carbon tax, and it makes them look good. Another fairly skeptical one is that if they're part of the process, they can keep it low. Another, though, a couple are that they know that something's coming down after Paris. There's going to be regulation. Things are going to cramp their style. And the carbon tax is, to them, the best of many of bad options. Plus, in a carbon tax, they beat coal. Oil beats coal. So there's potentially some self-interest here involved, and certainly the ground is starting to shift. And we've got major banks actually advocating for a price on carbon as well. All right, so I admit that Jevons never said this. And it's possible that I've been thinking a little bit too much about this guy, and he's kind of gotten into my head. But here he's sort of this combination of sort of nemesis, devil's advocate, voice beyond the grave. But what he's saying here is fine. What does all this matter? The fossil fuel companies have so much skin in the game, so many resources in the ground that's on their books. What's going to stop them from just digging it all up and burning it all? And if that's the case, what we're doing is just delaying the inevitable. What's the point? Now, the research shows that, and there's been recent research that answers the question, what happens if we burn it all? And this is what happens. It takes a while, but that's what happens. That's crazy. And I mean, we're talking, so granted, this is on the scale of thousands of years, right? But we're talking about change at a biblical scale here. So I want to allow you to really go dark here and to talk a little bit about this question of, will we really just burn it all? And then I'll come back in a couple of minutes. So I'm going to dive now into that question. And it starts with this story. And that's 1001 Days in the Life of a Turkey. And that is Thanksgiving. So what this is showing essentially is the impact of confirmation bias. So this comes from a book by Nassim Nicholas Taleb called The Black Swan. And this is the life of a turkey, right? On day one, he's got a nice free range he gets to run around in, and clean water, great food. He knows what's coming day to day. He's got a good life. I mean, there's some ups and downs, but he basically knows what's going to happen in the morning when he wakes up and how that day is going to go, and gets an understanding of kind of the boundaries of his existence. And day in and day out, he sees the same thing, and he understands his universe really well, he thinks. And it's confirmed day in and day out that this is what's happening. What could go wrong? And of course, he can't see what's going to go wrong. He's unable to understand that that's coming, and that the entire system that is his life is about to be disrupted. And then, of course, Thanksgiving comes, and the axe comes down, the feathers are plucked, and he's served for Thanksgiving dinner. And of course, everything has changed for the poor guy. And that event right there is called the Black Swan event. The thing that nobody saw coming that changes everything, that really disrupts an established system that people assume they understand. And what the author of The Black Swan argues in his book is that many of the turning points in human history can be defined using this graph. So one example is 9/11. Another is the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. The graph could be used to describe ecosystem collapse. An ecosystem absorbs stresses over time, but finally a turning point is hit and everything falls apart seemingly overnight. Social change. It describes social change. So the election of the first black president, the coming of marriage equality. So it can describe both negative and positive events, but in all cases, we're looking at a system-disrupting event that nobody saw coming. So shortly after I read this book, I saw this image, and I think it looks a lot like a black swan. So this comes from the investment firm Sanford Bernstein, and they're in charge of managing $454 billion of assets. And so they're sober folks, right? And they call this graph Welcome to the Terror Dome, because they know something big is afoot. And they shared this with their energy investors in an energy report a couple years ago. And what it's showing is what's happening in emerging Asian markets with energy. So this is the price of energy provided by different sources. On the bottom is the wavering lines of the status quo. So so that's the price of energy provided by fossil fuels, gas, coal, oil, and liquefied natural gas. And then falling out of nowhere comes solar energy. Didn't even register on this graph before the 2000s. Suddenly it comes in, swoops down, and is challenging two forms of fossil fuels on price without subsidy in 2012. And what Sanford Bernstein is saying is that they expect that downward trend to continue because solar energy is a technology and not a fuel. So innovation drives price. And that's true also for wind. And so, in the computer industry, we know about Moore's law, which says that every couple of years, the number of transistors that fits on a computer chip will double. And that describes this exponential increase in computing power as well as the really rapid decrease in the cost of that computing power. In the solar space, we have something similar called Swanson's law, and it's also known as a learning curve law. And it says that with every doubling of solar capacity deployed around the world, we see a 20% reduction in the price of PV modules. It's actually a little higher than 20%. And this is what that's done to the price of PV. So from 1977 to today, the price of PV modules has gone down by 99.6%. It's really pretty astounding. And it's continuing to fall. So on the right, we see solar PV levelized cost of energy, which is looking at not just the price of the modules, but the overall cost of generating and delivering solar energy. And that has gone down by 78% in the last 5 years. And on the left, wind is also going down rapidly at 58% in that 5-year period. Not quite as fast as solar, but it has a big head start against solar because it's already considerably cheaper at the utility scale. So Sanford Bernstein goes on to say that solar will start to drive fossil fuel price down. So it's going to turn things on its head. When I think about the relationship between fossil fuel price and renewable energy, I get freaked out when I hear that fossil fuels are low because I feel like, oh, that means renewables aren't going to be able to compete. Well, what Sanford Bernstein and Bloomberg New Energy Finance and others are saying is that that is about to change and it's going to start moving the other direction where solar actually drives fossil fuel price. It's not happening yet because solar is still too small a wedge of the energy pie. And it needs to increase by 10x. So, you hear 10x and you're like, okay, great. Get back to me when that happens. This is what is happening with solar globally. So this is from 2000 to 2013, absolutely exponential growth. Between 2011 and 2013, the solar deployed around the world has doubled. So if this continues, and so far it is continuing, then we will see in just a few years a 10x increase in solar deployment around the world and reach that day when solar can start driving fossil fuel price down. And if you were wondering if this is a black swan event that nobody saw coming, check this out. The blue line shows the actual solar deployment. Those other lines are predictions by the International Energy Agency. If there's anybody who should be able to understand that this is coming and see it coming, it would be these guys. These are total experts, right? But year after year, they keep on assuming it's going to be gradual linear change, which I think is about confirmation bias. That's what they understand. But we're talking about a technology, not a fuel, and it's changing the game. Wind is the same here. Wind is, the blue line is wind, the dark blue, and then we see the predictions from the International Energy Agency, and boy, they're trying hard to catch up, but they aren't doing it. And it's not their fault. That's the definition of a black swan. But for technologists, it's probably not a huge surprise because they're used to this S-curve from technology uptake. Successful technology follows this curve. You see the bell curve shows the innovators, the early adopters, the early majority, the people who are adopting the technology. That translates into that S-curve that goes up to 100% market share over time. This happens with all sorts of technologies. So you see that S-curve for cell phones, for dryers, for microwaves, for air conditioning, all sorts of stuff. All right, so solar is going to drive fossil fuel price down. Why does that matter? It matters because of stranded assets. And a stranded asset for a fossil fuel company is an asset that's in the ground that they can't drill or dig. So oil or natural gas or coal that has to stay in the ground. Either for moral imperative because we say, hey, enough is enough, and we regulate it and say, you can't dig, or for market realities, that it just becomes too expensive to drill for a given price. Now, what we're looking at here comes from Citibank, and they put this together in the months leading up to the Paris conference. It's called an oil cost curve. And it borrows really heavily from some really great work by the Carbon Tracker Initiative. And what we're seeing in that text that you can't read are oil reserves around the world. On the left-hand side are the oil reserves that are easy and therefore cheap to drill. And then as we get further and further along to the right, we're dealing with reserves that are difficult and therefore expensive to drill. like, say, reserves in the Arctic. So when they put this together in the months leading up to Paris, the price of a barrel of oil was $75 a barrel. So I should explain as well, this y-axis is the cost of oil, and this is the break-even point. This green line shows the break-even point. The price of a barrel of oil needs to be this high or higher for a given resource to pencil for the oil company. If it's not, the oil company loses money drilling that resource. So at $75 a barrel, all of these green resources don't pencil. They're called into question. Now, since then, of course, the price of a barrel of oil has gone way down. It actually went really way down, and now it's at $50 a barrel, where that red dot is. At that price, if that price were to persist, and full disclosure, fossil fuel companies don't make decisions on a single day, to drill based on a single day's price. But if that were to persist, that would call into question fully 2/3 of the oil reserves on this chart, and would effectively strand them. So this is where I get really excited, and as a high-performance builder and somebody who cares about passive house and cares about the climate, is that when we make super efficient buildings and make the building sector more energy efficient and make our economy more efficient, we are destroying demand for fossil fuels, and all things equal, we're pulling that red dot down the green line and stranding more fossil fuels in the ground. Likewise, when we put solar panels on the roof, we're part of that Swanson's law, where we're helping to be part of that movement to drive down solar price and also increase the market share of solar and its impact on fossil fuels, and drive that red dot down the line. Now, this relationship between the price of a barrel of oil and the decision-making of oil majors just played out in our front yard, right? So that's the Shell oil rig that was parked in Elliott Bay. And there was all sorts of awesome and very important protesting and civil disobedience and kaya activism that happened around this rig. Shell went up to the Arctic anyway, but meanwhile, the price of a barrel of oil started to plummet. And at some point, they threw their hands up and said, this is crazy. We are wasting our money. We're never going to recoup it. The oil is too cheap. Because thanks in part to they haven't said this, but thanks in part to the protests, we're unclear about what the regulatory environment is going to be anyway. We're out of here. And so they now have suspended their operations in the Arctic thanks to this dynamic. So yeah, this is what, I think, and I imagine some of you feel this way too, sometimes it's hard to draw the connection between the work that we do, and sometimes it's hard to get, wow, okay, good, we got another passive house project is happening, but what real impact is that having? And I do believe that there is a really clear through line between the work that we're doing and the ability to strand assets in the ground and to hopefully find climate security. So Carbon Tracker Initiative has this line, they say, climate security equals fossil fuel demand destruction. It's not the sexiest line, but I think it's pretty great. And this is where we get to virtuous cycles and nonlinear change on the solution side. There are all sorts of scary, vicious cycles, but we've got virtuous cycles that we can be part of accelerating. So I already talked about the Swanson's Law one, right, with solar panels and the ability to be part of that movement and to destroy demand for fossil fuels. There's a very similar, I think, learning curve law around energy efficiency. As we do more energy efficiency, we get better at it. We can deliver it more affordably. Also, we have more market share and more market power. So manufacturers of key components like triple pane windows and really cool, efficient components in buildings will be more likely to manufacture them locally and more cheaply, and so that can start building on itself and drive this exponential change, hopefully. Grid transformation. As we bring more negawatts on through energy efficiency to the grid and more renewable energy onto the grid, that helps to idle conventional power plants, which makes their power more expensive, which makes the other forms of negawatts and renewable energy more attractive, and that has the potential to start a nice positive feedback loop with positive consequences. And then, of course, I've already talked about the fossil fuels keeping it in the ground with the stranded assets. So all these things can come together to destroy demand for fossil fuels. All right, but what does all this cost? And again, Citibank, in the months leading up to the Paris conference asked this question in this report, Energy Darwinism 2. And what they did is they took a look at two scenarios. The first scenario was business as usual. They call that city in action. So inaction. And the other one was action. And action was defined as changes in the energy mix and energy efficiency investments so that we could we'd have a reasonable chance at keeping warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And what they did is they looked at those two scenarios and they asked the question, which one is more expensive for fuel and capital expenditures? So those are the only two things, capital expenditures and fuel. Which one would be more expensive between now and 2040? Both of them are very expensive. Energy isn't cheap, whether it's dirty or clean. Which one is more expensive? And as you see, the inaction was $1.8 trillion more expensive than the action, according to Citibank. Not according to Greenpeace. I love Greenpeace. We're talking about Citibank, right? They don't have a lot of vested interest in this, so I think that's encouraging. And they're talking about that totally unrelated to societal costs of global change or global climate change. So runaway climate change, they very conservatively peg, and they admit that it's conservative because they're looking at only linear change, not the possibility of nonlinear change like the collapse of our ocean ecosystems with runaway climate change. But they peg that at $72 trillion. Now, it's not to say that this is easy, right? Because efficiency and renewables are all about capital expenditure, which means it's all about upfront investment. So this requires some long-term thinking. So this red line shows the differential between the two scenarios. And you can see that the red line goes up because the course of action requires upfront investment. So by a decade in, that accumulates to as much as maybe $1 trillion. And if we really actually did this right, it would be higher because we were actually targeting 1.5 degrees Celsius, not 2. But over time, that then the lack of fuel costs related to energy efficiency and renewable energy starts to kick in, and you get a net benefit of $1.8 trillion at the end. So I think that Jevons Paradox can be damned, frankly, because this is the real paradox that we're up against. And that's this huge disjuncture between the colossal risk and cost of inaction on climate that's likely much higher than $72 trillion here, versus the tiny, even the savings related to action on climate. And so this brings me to this point, and that is that we are right to fight climate denialism. It breeds inaction, and it does so by distorting our understanding of the problem. It says that there is no problem. Don't worry about it. It's fine. I think we need to be equally vigilant now of climate defeatism, because it also breeds inaction, but it does so by distorting our understanding of the solutions, by saying they're impractical or they're too expensive, or they're counterproductive because of the Jevons paradox, or it's pointless because we're going to burn it all anyway. I think in some ways it boils down to something really quite simple for us. And that's that we have at our fingertips the means to transform the energy performance of our built environment. And that, I don't mean to be Pollyanna about this. That's not easy. And we are certainly in a race against time right now. And it's possible we're just going to drive right off the cliff. I don't think we are, but it's possible. I think we're going to figure this out. And if we do, as a species, figure this out and turn it around, then builders and designers and engineers and owners of really great, efficient buildings and passive house are going to be playing a starring role in the climate solution making that's to come. And we're not only transforming the built environment when we do this work, we're also laying the groundwork for the future green energy grid. Because when we reduce the energy load on that grid through energy efficiency, we're not only reducing the overall energy load, but we're also flattening out the peaks and valleys of that load, which makes it much easier to then fill in the gaps with a mix of renewable energy with storage and with demand response. So this idea came up at the Living Future conference. Yeah. This came up in a keynote, and he was quoting from this guy, Nick Marks, he has a great TED Talk. You should check it out. Right. MLK didn't say I have a nightmare. He said, I have a dream, right? And he talked about going to the mountaintop and seeing the promised land. And he defined a vision that people could care about and fight for, a positive vision of the future that they could care about and fight for. And I think that we in this community and those of us who care about climate action and the future of our planet and are engaged in building could do a better job at pointing at the climate solutions that are at hand and defining that sort of positive vision for all of us. One that's regenerative, one where distributed energy provides energy democracy, or resilient, super efficient structures deliver affordability to people that live in these structures and long-term energy security. And there are signs that we are actually turning this around, that we're going in the right direction. So the economy is growing, but carbon emissions aren't. International Energy Agency, who weren't able to see the exponential change, they show that in the last 2 years, greenhouse gas emissions have been flat, even as the economy has grown globally. That's the first time that's ever happened. Wow, the US built more solar than natural gas last year. Yeah, things are starting to shift with renewable energy and in the energy mix. Texas, of all places, is a leader in renewable energy. In December, they provided 45% of their electricity for 17 hours straight. Coal in the US, at least, is in free fall. So Peabody Energy, the largest mining company in the country, filed bankruptcy and joined a whole bunch of their peers in that state of bankruptcy. And coal projects are being canceled left and right. Portugal went 100% renewable for 4 days a week and a half ago. Germany, which has much less sun, almost reached 100% renewables last week. China slashed the coal use and greenhouse gas emissions for the second year in a row, raising the question of whether maybe they're reaching peak coal over a decade earlier than they committed to. And coal in the UK. We're back to coal in the UK here. For the first time since 1882, the UK had energy that was coal-free for several hours, several days in a row. And fossil fuels just lost the race against renewables, according to Bloomberg. We're set. It's not that simple, of course. But the point is that now we're seeing globally more investment in renewable energy than in fossil fuel energy in terms of capital investments. And the thing that makes me really hopeful is what's going on with young people and the way that they're involved in the judicial system to challenge the government for our government's lack of action on climate change and the lack of progress in ensuring a good future for our kids. They're winning these battles. So in King County, we just had a judge make a historical ruling against the Washington State Department of Ecology around climate change. In Oregon, again, federal court, these kids won a case around climate change. Yesterday, the day before, these two teenagers won in Massachusetts. And there are many other challenges going on around the country in other states, and there are challenges that are going around in other nations. So if we can't figure it out, maybe our kids are going to figure this out. All right, so back to buildings. So this is exponential change. Granted, it's early days. But this is the increase in square footage of passive house in the United States. If you go to the Living Future Institute, they have a similar looking graph for net zero energy buildings and living buildings. So we're beginning to, the early stages of exponential change are getting set in our space as well. And overall, our sector is making progress. This is a complex graph. It's the last graph I'm going to show you. So bear with me, and I'll try to explain it. This I saw last week at the Living Future Conference when Ed Masria from Architecture 2030 presented. And what he's showing here is these are projections by the US Energy Information Agency of the energy use from our building sector between 2005 and 2030. And it's taking into account the expectation that there will be 60 billion square feet of new construction. And so back in 2005, just in the early days, or maybe just before Architecture 2030 got going, based on our behavior as an industry, the Energy Information Agency decided that we were in bad shape. We were going to go way up with our use of energy in buildings. As we were able to implement more and more efficiency measures and introduce passive house and net zero energy and other things, that's gotten better and better every year. So now we're flat, even getting negative. And as those exponential curves hopefully continue, then we can see that line go down towards zero, which is where we need to get it, energy use plus renewables. So I'm really excited to hear about the projects that are about to be presented and the exemplary work that's being done and these real-world examples of climate-friendly construction. And I want to leave you just with a couple thoughts. The first is that we're in non-linear territory. And that's true both on the climate crisis side, which is really scary, but it's also true on the climate solution side. And that it makes it inherently impossible to really know if we're going to win this race or not. But what I do know is that we can accelerate the exponential change on the climate solution side, that we in this room can be part of many, many virtuous cycles that can drive this where it needs to go. So what I'd like to urge everyone to do is to keep your nose to the grindstone and to try to make the best buildings you possibly can, whether they're passive house or net zero energy, because we need to propel this revolution forward. And it is a revolution, but it's a revolution that's in its infancy, and it needs your help. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.